Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is going to be dedicated to the Man Booker International Prize, which I think as a reader has become my favourite prize because it presents me and introduces me to books that I almost certainly wouldn't have heard of, and certainly the two I'm going to talk about today fit into that category in a way that the other prizes don't. Now that doesn't mean it's the best prize in terms of I find favourite reads, but certainly I've got as much chance finding a favourite read in the Man Booker International than I do the Women's Prize or even the Booker Prize proper. So I only learned of this prize existence last year, and I read I think 3 of the shortlist. None of those books made it into my sort of books of the year, but I was really glad that I'd read them. This is different because this year, because I'm almost certain one of these books is going to make it into my top reads of 2019. Okay, so when the original long list came out, there were 2 books I fancied, and they're the ones I bought, and I didn't really get to read them until last week and this week, which meant that the shortlist announcement came out. And both of these books made the shortlist. So that means of the shortlist of 6, I've read 3, because the other book on it was what I read last year, which was Olga Tokarczuk's Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead. And the reason I read that was because she won the prize last year with Flights, and that really didn't appeal to me, but I did want to read her. So that book came out and I read it. And it's a good read, but a sort of cosy, slightly eccentric, middle-aged lady, sort of eco-mystery. And I just got the feeling that that was her shtick. I know Flights is very different, but I just got the feeling that, and this may be completely unfair of me, but that's what she writes, you know, that it has a very sort of an eco sort of message, which is fine. But I felt I probably didn't need to read anymore. So it was a good read. I enjoyed it. I'm glad to say that I've read a Tokarczuk book, but it certainly wouldn't be my nomination for winning this year's prize. Plus, she won it last year, and you know, judges tend to want to spread the love. Anyway, so the 2 shortlisted books that I have read. One is The Years by Annie Ernaux on Fitzcarraldo Editions, and the other is The Shape of the Ruins by Juan Gabriel Vasquez, a Colombian writer. I'm going to start with the Vasquez. So this is a book about sort of real life historical events and is sort of grappling with the concept of conspiracy theories. And now you've heard of a book within a book within a book. Well, this is a conspiracy within a conspiracy within a conspiracy. So there is a character called Juan Vasquez who is a writer. Although, you know, which begs the question, you know, is this metafiction or is this what's known as autofic, as in very autobiographical fiction? And I'm with Steve Donoghue about autobiographical fiction in that I'm not a fan of it, but as a writer I would say that actually all fiction is autobiographical fiction. The key artistry comes in the transformation, the mutation, the distortion of the autobiographical material that feeds into the book into something genuinely bigger than your story. And interestingly enough, both of these could be called autofic. I mean, it's interesting that this is in the Fitzcarraldo non-fiction livery, because their fiction livery is blue and this is in white. It's just non-fiction, and yet it's got forward to the, you know, the fiction prize that is the Man Booker International. And I'm going to make another video after this, not related to the International Booker Prize, about my other book that I've read recently, which is also autofic. But as I say, for me the key thing is, what level of transformation has the writer, has the artist brought to his material or her material? And in this, I get the sensation that there's very little, that this is heavily autobiographical. There are photos and plates of things mentioned in this book about the various conspiracies. Now, the person who is obsessed with the conspiracy is not the author character, Juan Vasquez. It's somebody called Carlos Caballo. And he is obsessed with an assassination in, I think, 1945, of a man called Jorge Gaitan, who was the mayor of Bogota, who was a very popular politician and was going to make a run at the presidency, and was felt to be a socialist, although sort of perhaps a socialist in the vein that Mussolini was before he turned fascist, in that, you know, sort of quite dictatorial, quite sort of charismatic, sort of, but authoritarian. But anyway, this guy Caballo is obsessed with the conspiracy that killed Gaitan. He was basically murdered in the street by two guys who were captured pretty quickly. They were sort of run to ground, and I can't remember now whether they were actually beaten to death a la Gaddafi in Libya, or whether they faced trial. I can't remember now. But Caballo is insistent that these two guys on their own could not have carried it out. There's a much wider conspiracy, and he also sort of invokes, you know, the Kennedy assassination, that that could not possibly have just been a single lone wolf gunman, and the same for Colombia. And then, in fact, all political assassinations have to be wider conspiracies. And in a sort of Don DeLillo underworld and Libra way, you know, this guy Caballo is very, he's obviously obsessed, he's maniacal about it, he sort of pushes the bounds of the law to get what he wants to prove these theories. He hurts his relationships with friends because he basically uses them and exploits them. And he's paranoid. And that, you know, that is the strength of this book. However, there is a structural weakness, because Caballo gets Vasquez to read a transcript or a document from an earlier assassination from 1914 of another political figure in Colombia called Uribe, apologies for pronunciation. And that section of the book, which is from about halfway on till just before the end, reads as a sort of historical work. So you don't get any of the tension or any of the personal stuff that Caballo's sort of conspiracy sort of mania injects into the first half of the book. So the first half of the book is far stronger. And when I say structurally it doesn't work, I don't mean that the book falls apart or collapses. It doesn't. It holds together. But the way it engages the reader drops off considerably. So the first half I felt was really engaging, because it was driven by this sort of mania of this character, whereas the second half is largely dominated by a fairly flat, you know, treatment in great detail of this court case investigation of the 1914 assassination attempt. And I think, you know, the point of the book is, and this is why I'm grateful to the book, you know, I don't know a lot about Colombia except, you know, sort of the narco capitalists of Medellin and Cali and how they operated. But this is a very good treatment of Colombian history from 1914 up to the point of the narcos. And indeed, slightly, you know, the point of the book is that Colombia is sort of born in blood. You know, Simon Bolivar threw off the shackles of Spanish colonialism and you know, fought for independence for countries that later became Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, and others. But Bolivar's great plan was they were going to form their own sort of federation, and that got very politicised. And out of that, all the sort of nationalists and, again, charismatic, slightly authoritarian leaders in these different countries said, no, we're not having that. We want our own countries. And, you know, the point is, I think, that this book is making, it's therefore even born in blood, has always been in blood. There's always been the fight in Colombia, at least, between the conservative right, which is sort of, you know, dominated by Catholicism and family, against the liberal left, which is, you know, rejects, you know, the power of religion in the state and veers much more towards democracy. But the tradition of the charismatic authoritarian leader, whether on the right or the left, goes back to the time of Bolivar, and then it's always, you know, percolates Colombian history, if not, you know, most of Latin American history. So I was very grateful to this book for a sort of, you know, filling a gap in my knowledge, But as I say, the first half was engaging, but as soon as the personal drive of Caballo disappears, because Vasquez is just reading this document that Caballo's given him, and that's how it's presented here, the novel drops off in its level of engagement for me. And also, I don't think it is metafictional elements at all, because he doesn't really do anything with him as a character in the book. It is autobiographical, or at least you get the sense that it is. So, it's a decent book. There are some problems with the writing, which I'll come to, not just the structure. But I don't see it as being anything, amazing. I mean, I haven't read the books that didn't make the shortlist, but I'm kind of surprised that this did, really, because it's sort of informative without being highly literary. And when I say highly literary, I don't mean sort of inaccessible, but it's not really doing anything in a sort of artistic fashion. So, but, the guy can write. There are periods in this where, there is some beautiful personal, emotional writing. So, to give an example of that, one night I wanted to speak to my father in his room but found him asleep. As I quietly left the room, I heard my sleeping father in a desperate voice say, "No, Papa, no." What strange, agitated dream was my father experiencing with his father? And if one thing caught my attention beyond the enigma of the dream, it was that my father was 78 years old at that time, and my grandfather had been dead for at least a quarter of a century. Does a man have to die to speak to his father? And, that's lovely. It's a lovely observation. There wasn't enough of that. And as all the stuff about Vasquez is, we don't really get a sense of his character. This book takes place over the course of quite a long time, and Vasquez is in different countries, trying to become a writer and all of that. But it's just, again, it's not very engaging. Okay, so a couple of examples of poor writing, and I don't think this is the translation, I think this is the writing. As usual, she was right. I've grown accustomed to Estella being right. However, it always surprises me. She's like Occam's razor in the guise of a woman, an interjection of common sense, a total incapacity for foolishness. She's like an Occam's razor in the guise of a woman. I just think is a really sort of leaden sort of phrase, metaphor or whatever. It's not good. And another one. The next morning before arriving at his simulated or pretend job. Well, you don't need simulated or pretend. The author has to make the choice for us, not offer them both to the reader, because it's meaningless, really. And he did it again. He said in another place, insolent and rude. Well, that's tautologous. I know that the words do have different shades of meaning, but you don't need them both in the same sentence. And then finally, in the sort of court case about the 1914 conspiracy, I told my neighbour what I'd just seen, and he went up to Carvajal's house. Later he told me he'd heard several voices. That is to say that there were other people. Yes, sir, a large meeting according to my neighbour. And what was the meeting about? My neighbour didn't tell me. He told me he couldn't hear what they were talking about, but they were important people. And I thought it strange that important people would go inside a tradesman's house just before midnight as if not wanting to be seen. Please, Your Honour, the plaintiff's counsel said, can the witness please abstain from interpretations? Well, if there's a sort of objection coming from one of the barristers about, interpretive nature of the witness, what about the actual basic fact that it's hearsay? He's reporting about what his neighbour told him. Now, I don't know Colombian law, but I can't imagine hearsay has any more legality or proof of evidence as it does in UK and American law. So that, again, seemed a bit weak to me. I'm just going to put the light on because it's got rather overcast here in London. Hang on a second. Okay, and on to the second book, The Years by Annie Ernaux. So this ostensibly is also autofic in that it is the story of Annie Ernaux, but it is the mutation, the transformation that she renders on the material is stupendous. I mean, I love this book. It's 5-star. Almost out to get in one of my in my top 10 reads of the year. I hope it wins the Man Booker International. It's an extraordinary piece of work because, as she says, to capture the reflection that collective history projects upon the screen of individual memory. So, you know, the book takes us through her life from post-war rural poverty in provincial France, right up to the turn of the millennium, basically. And a lot of it is prompted by her commenting on photos which have been tightly recorded, and on the back is written place and year. So it starts off with, as I say, with rural poverty, and then as you go into the 50s, you start getting the introduction of sort of new foodstuffs, which are largely processed. And then you get the introduction of new types of shops, as in supermarkets, to sell these foods. And so gradually it's the coming of the consumer revolution as you know, France moves out of the, you know, the Second World War and into, you know, the brave new world, as it were. And obviously there's technological changes. So, you know, the photographs eventually get replaced by home movies, and those get replaced by, you know, camera phones, sort of recorded footage. You also get, you know, the hold of the church is gradually loosened. And she says in here that, you know, once sex is no longer, you know, once the church no longer has control over people's sex lives, you know, what point is there for the church? So it's things like, you know, the contraceptive pill and you know, sort of women sort of being able to, you know, have a voice to some extent and to have a role in society. But it's very interesting, you know. 2/3 of the way through this book, I found myself thinking, I'm finding the bits where she's gone we, as in society, much more interesting than the parts where she's gone I, or describing herself third person as she. And then came along, at the point that I'd reached, and I was having that thought, a piece about her as an I or a she, I can't remember. And it was just, no way, actually, she's doing them both supremely well. So a very simple observation where she was going, you know, as she's sort of getting on in age, she's going, well, I used to push a shopping trolley around the supermarket, and now I only need a handbasket, because, you know, her two sons have left home. Or to give you another piece of just brilliant personal, emotional writing. A tumour of the kind that seems to burgeon in the breasts of all women her age, and appeared to her a normal occurrence, almost, because the things we most fear happen. At the same time, she received the news that a baby was growing in the womb of her eldest son's partner. The ultrasound revealed a girl, and meanwhile she lost all her hair as a result of chemotherapy. This replacement of herself in the world, without delay, profoundly disturbed her. I mean, I just think that's brilliant writing. But all the time there's this mix of the personal with what's happening in France at large. And it never lags, it never sags. You know, you just think, well, how could you sustain this? How can this continue to grab you? And it does. And you realise it's not just her biography, it's yours. Even though I'm not French, a lot of the world events portrayed in here was so paradigmatic. You know, AIDS crisis, the fall of the Berlin Wall, you know, it's 1968, you know, whatever it is. That I could, you know, if you're of an age, I remember that stuff. And it was part of my childhood and adolescence as well, you know. And that's the brilliant artfulness of this, you know. Unlike here, where I went onto Wikipedia to look up some of the names and events mentioned, I never went, you know, even though there's plenty of references of, you know, I assume, French minor cultural figures of film, TV, pop music and TV shows that I had, you know, never heard of. I didn't feel a need that I had to go and look them up, because it just blended seamlessly. I knew what she was saying, I understood it. And it's just, as I say, fantastic writing. So, you know, she described the sort of, when she was a child and meals around the tables, you know, this is in the aftermath of the Second World War, so the conversations are very much about the war and stuff. And as she grows older, and as France changes into the 60s and a whole different sort of, you know, consumerism and global media of American music and films, you know, penetrating all other cultures. You know, those conversations happen less and less, and of course there's fewer people to talk about them because some of them have started dying. But later she says, you know, that certain events of protests and you know, rebellions such as '68, but other things as well when people were brought out to the streets to oppose specific legislation and all that sort of stuff, very soon descended back to the same psychology of, were you a collaborator or were you in the resistance? That somehow France needed to still have that psychological division, and people needed to be on one side or the other. That it was part of their psychological makeup. It was very important to France, so that it, you know, all this sort of you know, political conflict was not new, was not in a new sort of context. It always had to sort of go back to the psychological space that had been carved out by the Second World War, resistance or collaborator, that they never really escaped that. And, you know, I thought that was fascinating. And, you know, there's so much stuff here because of the time period that it covers, but, you know, there are some fantastic insights that she provides and just gems of wisdom. So, under Giscard, we would live in an advanced liberal society. Nothing was political or social anymore. It was simply modern or not. Everything had to do with modernity. People confused liberal with free and believed that a society so named would be the one to grant them the greatest possible number of rights and objects. We exchanged the words of current morality for others that measured actions, behaviours and feelings in terms of pleasure, such as frustration and gratification. The new way of being was laid back and feeling good about oneself, a mixture of self-assurance and indifference to others. So I think it's a brilliant insight that, you know, even morality, which of course had been laid down for centuries by the church, had been replaced in a consumer society by, you know, measurement of pleasure, measurement of frustration or anti-pleasure, measures of gratification. And it's a, you know, a fantastic little insight. And then another one, you know, she still relies on photos to help her try and recover her memories. And she's talking about, you know, sort of Apple phones and the fact that you can take photos and all of that. And she says, well, the problem with them is that, you know, they are not, you know, unlike the early consumerism of the 50s where people appreciated objects for themselves. Because the phone is going to be replaced by an updated, you know, model next year, that they have, you know, that they're purely about functionality. People may sort of convince themselves that I've got to have this new phone because it does this, that and the other, and it's therefore beautiful. But actually, in the full knowledge that it will get replaced next year. So, you know, it's a brilliant dissection of modernity, of consumerism, of how it's changed people's mentalities, how it's changed society. And, you know, this book is chock full of that sort of stuff. I seem to have lost the other one that I'd bookmarked, which is a bit of a pain. Yeah, I can't find it. So, but, you know, this was an absolutely fantastic read. You know, I'm not interested in reading biographies, but this is so clever. It's my biography as much as it's hers. And it's the biography of France, and it's the biography of a lot of the world. Supreme, absolute supreme. So that's 5 stars. I wasn't sure what to award that in terms of stars. It's sort of 3.5 to 4 because I did get a lot out of it. So there you have it. In my next video, which will follow soon after this, I'm going to talk about this book, W.G. Sebald, The Immigrants, which is another book that on the surface is autofic, but like this, does an awful lot of transformative work in its form. So that it is an autofic. It's what I described at the beginning as actually, you know, using our stories, although it's not even clear that Sebald's doing that, but in such a way as to universalise it, to make it something much more than just pure subjectivity. Okay, thanks, till next time.